about me then and I'm just smiling, so I guess it was okay. I just want to first of all thank you all for being here and thank Professor Vetro and Gianluca and the university for having me here from Cambridge.
And I must have a little thing I forgot.
Okay.
We have to thank for funding your invitation, the Students Association Volo. We are a very, very active and very generous society of students, students who study the Near Eastern and Egyptology. So we have to thank Volo for funding your.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. So my talk today is titled Alterations and Appropriations. I've added a question mark in since I sent the topic title to Gianluca, and you'll realise why I added that question mark as I progress with my talk. An examination of some curiously modified false doors and funerary stelae from Egypt's first intermediate period. So this is some research that I'm currently undertaking on the side while I'm a postdoc at the Fitzwilliam Museum. As I think you said, coffins is my main area at the moment with the Fitzwilliam Museum. But this is an extension of my PhD research, and it does actually feed into a new project that we have running at the Fitzwilliam Museum on the subject of modifications and reuse. And I will mention a bit about the coffins and how it actually does work together. So the structure of my talk today is in two parts. So in part one, I'm just going to give you an overview as to what false doors and stelae are. Sorry if that sounds very elementary, but there are different types of stelae in particular that we encounter in the first intermediate period. I'll give you an overview to my PhD research and also a bit about the history and significance of the first intermediate period. But the bulk of my talk will focus firstly on this new project that I just mentioned at the Fitzwilliam, which my colleague Helen Strudwick is leading, on reuse, appropriation and ownership in ancient Egypt. Then I'll show you some examples of modifications made to first intermediate period false doors and stelae and how that feeds into this larger project. And I'll conclude by giving you a case study. So I've been looking at one false door at the Fitzwilliam Museum in great detail, working with an interdisciplinary team belonging to a woman called Hemi Ra. Am I speaking too slowly or too quickly for you? It's okay, you can follow? Yep, all right. And I don't mind if you want to ask me questions as I go, but otherwise we can wait till the end. Okay, so what are false doors and stelae? So collectively speaking, they are slabs of inscribed and decorated stone that served three main functions. So first of all, as a commemorative grave marker in remembrance of the deceased, as a place for priests and family members to leave offerings and to recite the name and achievements of the deceased, so essentially to maintain a funerary cult, and also to enable the deceased's car to come and go between the land of the living and the land of the dead, and to consume the food and drink offerings. Now, unfortunately, the majority of tomb contexts of first intermediate period false doors and stelae are now lost. But from those of the Old Kingdom, we know that they were typically placed in the west wall of the tomb chapels facing towards the east. But evidence also appears of them appearing outside the tomb in offering courts, above a doorway, or at the mouth of a shaft. And I'll return to this idea later because I do actually wonder if false doors and stelae during the first intermediate period had a much more prominent location than what we might actually suspect them to have. And I'll return to that shortly. So in my PhD that I finished at Macquarie University 2 years ago, I looked at 5 main types of false doors and stelae that I identified in my research. And I distinguished these based on their architectural features, although their functions most probably remain the same. So they are the false door, the stela maison, the stela proper, the atrophied stela, and the hybrid false door stela. And I'm just going to go through each of these briefly to give you an overview about their characteristics. So I'm sure false doors are very familiar to you. They look like a door, but of course you can't actually open or close it. It served a symbolic function for the deceased, as I just mentioned before. So they are first known to appear in the Old Kingdom, and they evolved out of the palace facade decoration featured on the exterior of elite mastaba tombs of the early dynastic period. So this decoration consisted of the palace facade with the alternating panels and recessed niches that was then adapted into the main body of the false door form. So you can see from the line drawing on the right, other characteristics of the door like the cornice, the torus moulding, the panel, the architrave, the central niche, and all these characteristics actually can be used as dating criteria in themselves. The second type is the stele maison. So this is French for house stela, which was first named by Gustave Jequier, and it's thought to represent a simple one-room house with a vaulted roof, but others argue that it represents a miniature of a tomb. So these small squat stone edifices were a short-lived tomb feature found only in the Memphite nome at Saqqara towards the end of the Old Kingdom, so mainly from the time of Pepi II, and we only have around 10 to 15 examples that exist. So you can quite easily date these based on their style, and also that we know that come from the Pepi II's cemetery complex, and Basil Dobrov has also discovered some more quite recently. They typically comprise a small false door recessed into the east face, flanked by representations of the tomb owner on either side. The third type is the stela proper, and this is thought to derive from the shape of the central panel in the false door form. They're typically rectangular, but they could also be vertical or square in shape as well. So as opposed to a false door, a stela lacks the presence of any alternating panels or niches, and it's flat. And given that tomb chapels during the first intermediate period were also quite commonly left undecorated, we also start to see many more scenes and inscriptions appearing on the stelae, which also suggests they serve as a condensed form of the tomb. So the remaining two examples are sort of subsets of the stela. The first one is the atrophied stela, which was first named by Henry Fisher. Possibly its origins come from the central niche of the false door. So they're known for their tall, elongated shape. And as we can see from this example in the Fitzwilliam collection belonging to a man called Hatshepsut, they often have some incised decorations from the false door as well. So you can see the cavetto cornice incised, and sometimes you also find the torus moulding incised as well. So from my research, it seems that these came originally from Abydos, and most of them are still found there. There are not very many examples either, so sort of around the 20 to 25 mark. And the last type is the hybrid false door stela. So you can kind of see how it evolved from the atrophied stela, but at the same time, they overlap. So again, it's rendered in 2D, so you've got elements from the false door form, but they're all flattened. So more examples, not just the cavetto cornice and torus, but the central panel. You have a central niche with a drum, and then the oversized figures that you'd normally find at the bottom of door jambs flanking either side of the central niche. So as I said, it's likely to have been a development upon the atrophied stela, but as is the case in so much in the first intermediate period, it's very difficult to precisely date because we find overlaps. So what I did in my PhD was I collected all known examples that I possibly could of all those types of false doors and stelae. At the time of my PhD, I had 612. It's more like 700 now. And these came from sites all over Egypt. But I looked at it between the reigns of Pepi II and Mentuhotep II because they provide us with firm benchmarks for dating. Then I looked at everything in between. And then I applied 5 dating criteria to try and see if we could establish some sort of a typology from which we could then date other objects and events from the period. So quite ambitious, as most PhDs start out. But the question is, why are false doors and stelae so important, and why try to use them for dating purposes? First of all, we have a lot of them, it's a high frequency, and they provide us with an unbroken link between the Old and Middle Kingdoms. They also intersect art, architecture, language, administration, and religion. So there's a wealth of information that can be gleaned from them. But they're also not without many challenges, as you'll soon discover. So I think it's important that I just give you a bit of an overview, go back a bit to what the first intermediate period is, what happened, why it's so neglected. So it's the modern name given by scholars to describe the intervening period between the Old and Middle Kingdoms. This is the name that Lepsius originally gave, as with all the periods that we know Egyptian history to have. But Ludwig Marentz has used the term the period of regions, which is also a reflective way of describing it. It's poorly defined in absolute chronological terms. So most modern scholars say around 150 to 215 years. Manetho said 700 years, but that's just untenable. And then in terms of the dynastic range, some say it starts with the end of the 6th dynasty, while others say it starts with the 9th dynasty. And then there's also confusion around the Heracleopolitan period being in one single dynasty or two separate dynasties. So a few years ago I did some research looking at the representation of First Intermediate period history in museums throughout Britain, and there still actually to this day there's no commonly agreed history or chronology that people are communicating. And because I'm a museum curator and I like to see how the public interact with Egyptian history, I wanted to try and tackle this. It's also typically dismissed by scholars because it's a period supposedly of chaos, disorder and decline. And this is because it was the first time in Egyptian history where there was a collapse in central kingship and a shift in administration from the Memphite capital to the provinces. So there's a number of really good histories existing already that you can read about the First Intermediate period. Stephen Seidelmeyer, for example, and Ed Blavatsky. But I just felt that there weren't any clear breakdown of the events. So I identified 7 key stages. I'm not going to read them all out to you, but I'll just refer you to the map. So to summarise the First Intermediate period as succinctly as I can. So the capital of Egypt until the end of the Old Kingdom was Memphis. Now, owing to either drought or climatic concerns at the time, and or because of Pepi II's long reign, there was a shift in focus to the provinces where more high officials were appointed. They started to get more control, creating a weakness in central authority. This kind of opened up an opportunity to a new set of rulers to emerge. We call them the Heracleopolitans. Peti was supposedly the founder of this line of kings. The question that remains, though, is with the Heracleopolitans, was this actually the site of their administration? So the Spanish team have been working there since the 1960s, and there's still no firm evidence to suggest this is where they based their capital. We certainly have evidence of Heracleopolitans living there, but whether it was the kings, that still is a big question that resides. The Heracleopolitans, I argue, did have control over Egypt, the whole of Egypt, for at least a short time, until a new family of local rulers in the south, the Insef family, emerged. We then find warring that happens on both a national scale, so between the Heracleopolitans in the north and the Thebans in the south, but at the same time there's a lot of interwarring happening between nomes. This is why people tend to dismiss it, because it does get very complicated when you try to work out what's happening and when and in which order. And at some point between Mentuhotep II's 14th and 39th regnal year, he reunified the whole country. We only have evidence really up until the point of taking a suit. We just sort of have some speculation about what happened northwards after that. Okay, so that's to give you an idea of the political disorder that was happening at the time, but there's also a lot of social and cultural fragmentation and complexity as well. So when we go back to false doors and stelae at this time, you'll see that there are actually 4 quite disparate types that we find, and this is where dating becomes quite complicated. So those types include the Memphite Heracleopolitan style. So this is in the north of the country, which carried on many of the olden traditions. The second type is the provincial Upper Egyptian style. So this is everything north of Thebes. And this type constitutes the most intra-variation of the group. And it's where we most distinctly see some of those very classic First Intermediate period characteristics of, these broad box-like shoulders, the pinched waists, the very long limbs, the almond-shaped eyes, and basically quite disproportionate. The next type is the pre-unification Theban style. So this is a very distinctive Upper Egyptian style that emerged in Thebes, which was dictated by the royal court there and comprised high-quality workmanship. So key features include high raised relief, deep sunk relief for the text, and then incised details. And then we have the post-unification Theban style, which is a more refined variation upon the pre-unification Theban style, but at this time we also find the introduction of the round-topped stela. So that in itself is also a dating criteria. Okay, so with all this diversity in the material culture on the one hand, but also with many gaps in it on the other, you can see why there is an important need for more fieldwork and study on the First Intermediate period. So in my PhD research, I set about trying to somehow make a contribution to this dilemma by applying 5 dating criteria. So just in summary, I looked at the hybrid false door stela, The Wadjet eyes, so looking at the placement of the eyes on stelae and on doors to see if there's a development. I looked at what I called the killing of the glyphs, but now I prefer to say the mutilation of hieroglyphic signs. So I looked at the mutilation of the viper, and I know Gianluca has a great interest in this subject as well, and the phonetic writing of Anubis, the owner holding a bow and sheaf of arrows, and the writing of the epithet, the revered one. But it's while working on these two dating criteria that I became really interested in modifications made to false doors and stelae. Modifications made both at the time that a stela was being produced and also retrospectively. So just quickly, the mutilation of the viper sign is characterized on false doors and stelae at this time as either being with a decapitated head placed above the body or in front of the body, or the viper being completely headless. And with the writing of Anubis, they started to use phonetic complements to replace the writing of the jackal. Very quickly in the burial chamber, the reasoning for this is around protecting the deceased for magical purposes in case the animal came to life to harm the deceased. But I argue in my thesis that it had more of a political motive on false doors and stelae at this time, more so in relation to the viper. But as you'll see here, these were all done at the time the stelae was being carved. But we do know from burial chambers in the Old Kingdom that scribes or artists could retrospectively come and return to make a modification to the monument. So this is Merowica sarcophagus at Saqqara, and they've gone back over the writing of the jackal to write the phonetic input for Anubis. Also in Huutia's burial chamber at Mer, you'll see that the viper sign has been pasted over, so he looks decapitated. So if we just sort of step back for a moment and we think about the practice of modifying objects in ancient Egypt more generally, we know that the concept is not new to us. So if we look at Karnak, for example, monuments were frequently reused or defaced. So we have here the statue of Ramses IV, that Pinodjem I in the 21st dynasty then went and usurped, if that's the correct term. So his titulary is written on top of Ramses IV. If we go to the inner sanctuary of the Amun temple, we'll see the defacement of Hatshepsut's cartouches. Then we also know that entire tombs could be reused. So this is the tomb of Inseba at Luxor, so originally dated to the reign of Hatshepsut, but was later repainted, the entire tomb, for a new owner, as you can see here. Then we want to also know about coffins. So Karakuni has done a lot of work on this. This is the coffin of Muthotep from the 19th dynasty that has a whole new decorative and textual overlay for a new owner in the 20th dynasty. So this is where I'll just bring in our coffins research at the Fitzwilliam Museum briefly, because we have identified reuse that the naked eye can't necessarily detect. So for the past, or more than a decade really, we've been CT scanning and X-raying our coffins collection to find out more about the way that they were constructed and decorated. And you get a sense of the types of, or how much wood has been used in the coffin construction and the types of joints that have been used as well. So you can see the blue outline indicates quite long pieces or planks of wood that have been used, but also much smaller ones as well. And we've worked with a big interdisciplinary team, so with an ancient specialist on ancient woodworking techniques, Jeff Killen, Elspeth Geltoff, who I know presented here last year, looking at historical painting techniques. We've worked with conservators and pigment specialists to try and get a better picture around the industry of coffin construction and production. So if you look at this cross-section of the box of, this is a 21st dynasty yellow coffin set belonging to a man called Nespai Sheffield, you'll actually see here with the brown that these are old mortise holes that have been filled in with bits of wood. So it's indicating that it's using reused wood for an older coffin to make this newer coffin, because the mortise holes that do work are next to it that line up with the lid above it. So we've been doing this with our entire coffin collection, and we're starting to see that reuse was really quite common. So we have this new project that Helen launched, and in February this year we held a 2-day colloquium. So reuse, appropriation, and ownership in ancient Egypt. So we brought together some people who are currently working on this subject. So Karakuni, for example, Nick Reeves, Miroslav Barta, and also students who have been focusing on these aspects in their own research to sort of brainstorm terminology around modifications, reuse, recycling, usurpation, and also try and see beyond coffins how prevalent was this practice. So the conversation typically focuses on the New Kingdom and the Third Intermediate period, but where my PhD research is feeding into this is showing that it happened a lot earlier as well. So I've identified two main types of retrospective modifications made to First Intermediate period false doors and stelae. I'm not going to talk about modifications made at the time of the production in this talk. And they are additions, so something that's been added to the false door or stela by the scribal artist very shortly after the stela was complete. So it's normally like a correction or responding to a request. And I'll give you some examples in a moment. And also defacement, so possibly made by a second hand with a malicious intent at an indeterminate point after the stela was complete. And I've added a question mark on after indeterminate because this is something that I'm focusing on now. Can we actually work out when these modifications happened? So let me just show you some selections of these modifications in my stelae corpus. Starting with an example of an addition. So this is the stela of Shemai from Nagada, and you can see outside the main composition of the stela, they've added afterwards a dedication text. So it says it is his father, his beloved, who made this for him. Then we find examples where they're written, so we've got Jeju, so the writing of Bucerus, and Abaju, Abydos, where they've left off a key sign, or multiple signs here, and you can see the writing on top of the borderline. Here we've got the false door of Neferu from Dendera, and you'll actually notice that they've added a pendulous breast to the figure. It's quite faint here, but they've added a breast over the pointed nipple. So this is actually a representation of, I'm going to come back to this later on because I talk about status in ancient Egypt, but he's painted yellow to indicate someone who worked indoors. He has rolls of fat on his stomach as well, and we think this pendulous breast also has an association with his aging status. I'll return to this shortly. Then we have examples here where it brings us to question the order in which a stela was decorated. So you'll see that there's a female figure here, possibly the wife of a female companion, who looks like she's been added after the rest of the stela was composed. There's quite a distinct end to that borderline there, and then they've depicted her. Then we find examples of defacement. So here they've scratched out the entire offering formula across the top, but they've kept the name of the owner. So above her head it says Iret, her name. Then on this example from Dendera in the Ashmolean Museum, sorry it's a bit hard to see, but they've scratched out the determinative, but they've left the name Penanu. I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts around this in just a moment. I'll just show you some examples first. And then here we find both the owner's face and his wife's face that's been scratched out. You can see more detail here. And on this interesting stela from Gabelane in the gem, you can see all the faces of the cupbearer as well, and the female figure below scratched out. On this false door in the Vatican collection, it's not just the face but the entire body in the central panel. Then here in the stela from Turin, it's not just the faces, but also the hands have been cut through, and also at the feet and the ankles. And then we find some cases of both additions and defacement. So you'll see the faces of the owner and his wife scratched out, and also the offering figures below. Plus there's an extra figure added on the outside of the second register line. Don't exactly know why that does follow the beginning of the biographical text, so it could be something to help accentuate what's being spoken, as you can see there. And then on this stela from Nagada in Florence, you'll see a figure that's been scratched in, or incised in afterwards, presumably between the owner and his wife. It looks like a staff now, but it was originally a bow that's been wiped out. And then we have a possible case of reuse, with a question mark. This is a stela belonging to Neb Heck in the Museum of Fine Arts Boston collection. And if you firstly look at the text, you'll see that there was originally another name underneath that's been wiped out and a new name, Neb Heck, written over the top. You'll also see there was originally a figure, probably a child, holding on to the owner's hand, and then a basket with a mirror, perhaps inside, has been carved over the top. And the rest of it looks like it's been quite hastily done. Now I need to look at this again now that I'm studying reuse and modifications, because I saw it about 6 years ago when I wasn't actually looking at this, so I need to see it again. But I just want to go through a few preliminary comments around what we're seeing here. So first of all, there are relatively few examples. So I didn't show you everything, but in total I have 15 false doors and stelae that show signs of additions, 28 false doors and stelae that show signs of defacement, and 4 false doors and stelae that show signs of both additions and defacement. So that's 47 out of a corpus of just over 700, which is less than 7%. And I think already that's quite interesting given the history of the first intermediate period that I just mentioned to you, the high amount of interwarring and competition between nodes. So what are we seeing? So I do think there are 3 things happening. So I said additions or afterthoughts. So it's presumably something where the master craftsman has picked up on and gone back to the original artisan and told him to correct it. Or could it have been the owner who's picked up on this? But was the owner literate? Could he actually read what was being written on his false door or stela? Don't know the answer to that, it's just a question. The other thing is perhaps the owner married afterwards, after the stela was produced, and then asked for that, spouse to be represented, or the child. Again, it's just speculation. The second thing that we're seeing is vandalism or defacement. So we're seeing that only once the determinative is erased on the name, but there are no examples at all where the entire name is being scratched out. So that makes me question whether or not the person doing this act could read anyway. And I'm going to return to this in just a second. But the defacement is purposeful and controlled. It seems that they were targeting what stelae they wanted to actually deface, and they've just focused on specific areas. But again, the name is not once scratched out in any of those false doors or stelae. So is this to do with the power of imagery? So I do wonder if this is an act of publicly shaming the individual. By scratching out their face, it is shaming them, but by keeping their name intact, I'm guessing that the can still take place around that false door or stela. So they can still retain the food and the drink to sustain them for the afterlife. Then I'm also beginning to question who was actually able to see these false doors and stelae. So chapels are meant to be open for people to come and visit, but were they in more of a prominent position? Were they on the outside of the tomb chapel? Just a thought. Something else, we're actually not seeing any clear patterns in provenance or patterns in location of where the defacement or the additions are being made. The cases come from Thebes, Gabelane, the Garda, Dendera, Naga Ede, and in the Memphite necropolis. I think it's very interesting to note that there are next to no examples of reuse. So I think Nebkek might have been reused, and there's one more false door which I'm going to talk about in more detail in just a moment that could have been reused. But a few things to point out around why that might be the case. First of all, stone isn't the easiest material to reuse anyway, unlike wood. Wood was much easier to break up and to recycle. Another thing to point out is at this time, a lot of the trade routes were being cut off, and there's a lot of control over access between sites, nomes, and quarries. So it does seem like they had enough access still and enough means to still produce false doors and stelae for themselves without claiming someone else's. But something else to think about is attitudes, ancient attitudes towards the act of reusing material. And this is where I will point your direction to the instructions for King Mary Kara. So this is essentially a treatise on kingship given by, presumably, Keti to his son, the future King Mary Kara. And I'll just read out a few lines. He says, "Do not despoil the monument of another. Do not build your tomb out of ruins. There was retribution for what I had done." This is after taking the house and the finite nome. For it is evil to destroy, useless to restore what one has damaged, to rebuild what one has demolished. Beware of it. A blow is repaid by its like. To every action there is a response. So were these actual real fears at the time, that by despoiling a monument, and presumably also usurping one, you'd be punished with an even greater reprisal. So for 12 months, I've applied the same type of methodology that we've used on the Copland's research to false doors and stelae. So using advanced imaging techniques and then also working as part of an interdisciplinary team, but working very closely with a stonemason, a geologist, conservators, other Egyptologists, and even an archaeobotanist, to actually try and see if we can find out more about these modifications. Can we work out if they're ancient modifications, modern modifications, or somewhere in between? And you can actually do that by looking at the carvings, the direction of the carvings, the types of tools used, and also what's really interesting to look at also is how they were produced. So is it one person who's carving a false door or stela? Are there a group of them doing it? Are they working from a copybook? So all these types of questions I want to see, can we actually answer this by having an interdisciplinary study? And I've also been working with a geologist to try and see the source of the stone and if we can actually identify the quarry where it came from. So as a case study, I want to focus on Henry Ra's false door with you now. It's a very unusual false door in the Fitzwilliam Museum collection that exhibits signs of modifications, rework, and possible reuse. So it's said to come from Bucerus in the Delta. Very few monuments have actually been discovered from here, even though this is a very famous site associated with the cult of Osiris. So many offering formulas will mention or invoke the god Osiris of Bucerus. Having said that, we actually haven't done very much archaeological fieldwork there for a long time, so it is in need of some extra work. So Henry Fisher first published this door in 1976, and since then there have been a few references made to it. Geoffrey Martin published it in quite a basic format in his Stelae of the Fitzwilliam Museum. Deborah Sweeney's done some work on it, and also Carolyn Grace Brown, but really it hasn't been studied in much detail since Fisher in the 70s. So the door is made of limestone and its current state measures 82.5 centimetres in height by 64 centimetres in width, but would have originally looked something like this. So we're missing the architrave, the top of the Taurus moulding, and the cavetto corners. And the door is unique for a number of reasons, and I just want to point out 3 for you here. First of all, Henry Ra is a woman. Now it's quite unusual for a woman to own a false door or stela at this time. Out of my 712 examples, I only have 98 belonging to a female. That's less than 14% of my entire corpus. Secondly, as I mentioned, there's a reference to Bucerus on the door, so saying a priestess of Hathor, and then Hathor, the lady of Bucerus. And as far as I'm aware, this is the only example where Hathor has a cult centre, supposedly, at the site of Bucerus. And it's actually based on this reference that Fisher attributes the door to Bucerus. Doesn't give any other explanation as to why he thinks it could be from here. Stylistically, in my opinion, it could easily be from Memphis as well, and I'll return to this a bit later on. But in terms of how the Fitzwilliam Museum acquired this door, that's also something that's really interesting to point out, because we don't have any information about it apart from the fact it came to us in 1909, purchased by Green, who was the director of the museum at the time, so the keeper of antiquities, and we know how much he purchased it from, but not from who. So I think the fact that Fisher said it's from Bucerus is really something to question. And the third and perhaps most unique feature that I want to point out about this door is that Henry Ra is arguably shown at 3 different life stages. So the first representation is as a seated, naked child or youth, according to Henry Fisher. Now the problem is that when Fisher published this door in the 70s, those that decided to write about the door later on, for the most part, carried on the same descriptions that he used. Now, Deborah Sweeney did question it though, because if you look at the representation, you'll see there's a kilt or a skirt at the knees. So she's not naked. If you also, well, hang on, so naked children, as we know, like porous are typically shown naked, with a side lock of hair and the finger to the mouth. So we're not seeing that here with Hemi-Ra. Second thing to point out is the ponytail. So we know that young female dancers in the Old Kingdom in particular were often shown wearing their hair in a ponytail with a disc at the end, just like we're seeing here with Hemi-Ra on the false door. The second stage that we see is Hemi-Ra depicted apparently as a woman in her prime or her sexual peak. So again, it's very subjective terminology that Fisher's used that other people have carried on. And what does that actually mean? And yet other people have followed this interpretation as well. And I'll return to this in a moment. But the third type, which you'll see on the bottom outer jams, is as an old or older woman with frontal sagging breasts. So these are again the words of Henry Fisher. Now this is a very rare representation since in 2D art, women's breasts are typically shown with only one breast exposed and the other one covered, as you'll see here. We do find some examples of drooping breasts in statuary, but these are usually of female servants or foreigners, never elites. So for example here, this is a figure of a miller in the collection of the Louvre from the Old Kingdom. So you can see a very similar pair of frontal sagging breasts, like we see with Hemi-Ra, but she also exhibits a number of other signs indicative of old age. So she's quite gaunt, she has nasolabial folds, there are lines at the corners of the mouth and bags under her eyes. Now the fact that Hemi-Ra doesn't bear any of these characteristics of old age, she is not wrinkly or frail looking. In fact, it's most unusual that she is shown seated in the younger version and standing in the older version. Perhaps suggests that there is another explanation to be had. So if you look at this figure from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we'll see that she also exhibits sagging breasts, but in her role as a mother or wet nurse feeding a child. Similarly, this naked woman in the form of a coal vessel is shown with a bulging stomach, most probably indicative of pregnancy, and again has a pair of drooping breasts. But if Hemi-Ra was being shown with drooping breasts as an expression of her fertility and recent childbearing, then why isn't there any mention of her children on her false door? Now, drooping breasts were actually not desirable in ancient Egypt because we do have from the Ebers Papyrus a remedy for sagging breasts. So that's quite disgusting, but you're supposed to apply the menstrual blood of a recently menstruating young girl to then retain their perkiness. Now, since Fisher's article 42 years ago, scholars have for the most part accepted and followed his observations unchallenged. But since I've started this interdisciplinary study of the false door, we've made a few startling results, and I'd like to share with you a few of these here. Now, these concern the material and surface treatment of the door, evidence of modifications, and also some paleographic peculiarities. So I'll start with the material and surface treatment of the door. So as Fisher has rightly pointed out, traces of red paint are visible on Hemi-Ra's door in the hieroglyphic text and also on the inside of the Taurus moulding. Interestingly, red paint also covers the deceased's arms and her dress, which is unusual since women are typically shown in ancient Egypt with yellow skin and men with reddish-brown skin to arguably distinguish their indoor-outdoor roles. So can you see the red pigment? It's hard to see here, but under a microscopic dino light, you can definitely see it. So this is how women and men are normally shown with their skin colours to differentiate them. Now, given that the red paint is very faded, but can also be detected on the jam lines, over the Taurus moulding, in the central niche, and on the arms and dress of some of the figures, it would actually seem that perhaps the whole door was originally painted red, perhaps to imitate a more expensive material such as granite. Now, we already know of examples where this happened. So if you've been to the British Museum, you would have seen this sculpture of Tarshek Set, which is painted red to imitate granite, as I mentioned. We also see it in the Heracleopolitan period, with this one here, for example, of Keti Ahu from Heracleopolis. But when we used dino light, so microscopic magnification with a light, breaking light, we can actually see that there are two key areas on the false door that have not been painted red. The first one is the central panel. There is no trace of any pigment on the central panel. The second area, are the faces and upper bodies of the figures at the bottom of the jambs, including the entire figure on the proper right outer jamb. So all of here, and then parts of here, the face, and then the upper section of the body there. So to make that clearer, here's a line drawing of the false door. So what I did was I coloured in every section of the door where I could see red pigment. And then it looks something like this. So this area sort of running through the middle is where there's mud trapped in the hieroglyphs. But you'll see that the central panel is completely clear of red paint, and also parts of the figures down here. Now, if you look at the central panel, you'll actually see that there are a number of areas that show clear signs of having been reworked. So if you look at Hemira's head, the stone has been smoothed around the back of her head, in front of her here, under the arm and underneath the table, and underneath the chair. It's been smoothed. Again, if you look under a different type of raking light, you can still see it. Plus, we can start to see these scratching marks emerging. Can you see some incised lines underneath the offering table and also underneath the chair? We can also see some cross-hatching incised lines in the central niche, and we can see some scratching marks in front of the seated figure at the bottom of the jamb. Now, stylistically, the representation of Hemira in the central panel is quite similar to the one on the lintel below. However, there are no signs of modification or rework to this representation on the lintel. Her head is also less elongated here than it is on the central panel. Her fillet is exposed, and the beaded detail in her collar is lacking. But actually, if we look at her head here, we've noticed a line that looks like the head has been extended from the original outline underneath. And you sort of see that this line, I can't really reach, but around there. Now, if we compare the figures in the central panel and on the lintel to the bottom of the jambs, we'll also see that they're stylistically quite different. So arguably, these ones are much more crudely executed, with less definition given to the arms and legs, particularly on the inner jambs. Now, if we focus on the figures from the outer jambs, you'll also notice a different patina to the stone. So it's much lighter and whiter in these areas. The carving is also deeper, with much attention given to the figure's large almond-shaped eyes, nose, mouth, and in particular the full frontal sagging breasts. So what this is essentially telling us is that the heads and breasts in the first three figures and almost all of the body in the fourth figure have been recut. You can also see that they've extended the wig in this figure here. Now, Trevor Emmett, our consultant geologist, confirmed that this whiteness in the stone is the next stratum or layer in the limestone, which we can also see on the faces here of the figures on the inner jambs. Now, we know that the recarving of all these bottom figures must have happened at some point after the whole false door was finished and painted red, because if we look closely at this detail, you'll actually see red pigment trapped in the wigs, in that relief of the wigs. And also, if we look at the central panel and the depth of it, it's actually set back much more than what we normally expect to find in a false door. And it slopes downwards, which, as described to me by stonemason Matthew Beasley, who we've been working with, is most probably because the door has been carved on the vertical. So we naturally see a sloping profile in keeping with the downward motion of the chisel. But the real question is, why would someone or some people bother to modify and recarve these particular sections of the false door? So if we just step back for a moment, and if we look at the false door in its entirety, even before these modifications were made, Hemira's false door was intentionally carved to show her in three different guises. Whether or not we should be understanding these guises as life stages, however, remains unclear. But it is indeed reminiscent of at least two false doors dated to the end of the Old Kingdom and the First Intermediate period respectively, where a male owner is shown physically different to his door. So the first example belongs to Mary Idu from Saqqara in the British Museum collection. He's depicted here with a short wig, a drooping breast and knee-length kilt. Then here in the traditional form with a staff and sceptre. And thirdly, as a courtly figure in older age with rolls of fat on his stomach, a drooping breast, short wig and a long kilt. Another example, so I showed you this just before, which is perhaps even contemporary with Hemi Ra, is this false door of Neferu, who's a high official from Dendera. Again, we'll see that he is shown 3 times on the door, so twice on the central panel and also down here on the inner jamb in the sort of traditional guise. But in this representation, as I pointed out before with the sagging breast, he has yellow skin and it looks like he's achieved a very high position in the administration and showing his confinement to working indoors. And also, it's interesting that the wife is shown looking youngish in both representations. So this does remind us to some extent of what we're seeing on Hemi Ra's false door. So this brings us to question. After Hemi Ra's false door was complete, could she have made a personal request for the master craftsman to modify the way she is depicted on the aforementioned sections of the door in order to reflect her high status or maturity? But if this is the case, then why didn't the artist paint over these sections again in red? I'm therefore more inclined to think that the modifications were made at some point after Hemi Ra's death, and the door was presumably inset in the tomb. This also explains the sloped carving that we're seeing on the central panel. But the artists or craftsmen working on Hemi Ra's false door weren't always known for getting things right, or for being consistent. So if you look at the text on the door, First of all, you'll see that sometimes there are incised lines in some of the hieroglyphic signs, but in other times there isn't. Then we'll see base protrusions underneath the writing here of the spinal cord sign, and then other times without any protrusions at all. Then we find the Akbird represented here strangely with 2 heads, as you can see in the top there. And on the entire proper left side of the door, the S sign, or the folded cloth, is written the wrong way around. The quail bird down here is also written the wrong way around. So where does this leave us? At an early stage of the research, some colleagues and I suspected that perhaps Hemi Ra wasn't actually the original intended owner of the false door, and that maybe the door was carved initially for a man before being abandoned and claimed by Hemi Ra. So some further evidence of this can actually be seen with the standing figures at the bottom, where you'll see the fist of the individual clenched and holding onto some folded cloth. This is what we typically find with men. And I gave a brief talk on this door at the British Egyptology Congress last year, and someone pointed out to me about the feet not overlapping. So women's feet typically overlap where men's do not. Now, it does also raise some interesting questions around the order in which a false door was carved, and how much of the door was made in a generic state before it was personalised for the buyer. So to conclude, this is an abridged version of what I've been working on. I'm going to have to leave you partly in suspense as our research is still ongoing, but I can at least share with you the direction in which we're heading with this false door. So first of all, we're continuing to work closely with stonemason Matthew Beasley to look at the modifications and the carving of the door. The next step is to apply RTI, so reflectance transformation imaging, to get clearer images of the tool marks to try and see if there are any signs of a modern hand at play. But from visual inspection, Matthew does suspect that it's all ancient. Something else that I'm currently looking at is the possibility of a different provenance for the door, so the Memphite gnome rather than Bucerus. And this is mainly based not just on the style of the door, but also in the inscriptions here, the first god mentioned that's invoked here is Ptah Soka, which is a god associated with the Memphite necropolis, the Memphite gnome. We've also worked with an archaeobotanist, which you might think, why would you do that in relation to a stone object? but we discovered these little black specks on the door, and we suspected this might have been lichen, which is a type of fungus. So I got Alan Clapham to come in and to use the dino light on the door, and I was thinking that perhaps, because we know species of lichen that can be associated with particular parts of the country. So if we could do that, it could at least tell us, or perhaps not where the door originally came from, but maybe where it was stored or housed at some point in time. Unfortunately, it revealed that these black specks, which I have a picture of, it's very faint. Can you see these black marks here? It's actually manganese dioxide, which is a chemical reaction in the stone, so it couldn't actually help us with the problem in this case. So then I turned my attention to a geologist, so Trevor Emmett. So we've now been working in the British Museum collection with the Clem collection of stone fragments that they have. So Rosemary and Dietrich Clem are some German geologists who spent a lot of time, their whole lives, working in Egypt. They collected some fabulous samples of stone from quarries all across the country. So we can now try and match up the stone of Hemi-Ra with stone in the Clem collection at the British Museum. This is not without challenges though. It's very difficult to specifically pinpoint one particular quarry. What Trevor has been able to identify though is that it's most probably from the Makassar region, so not from Giza though, which would have been more accessible for them if the door is from the delta. But the thing is that stone is portable, so even if it was quarried from there, it's not to say it still couldn't have been, made for someone in Bucyrus. Finally, there are many unusual characteristics of the text, both in terms of grammar and content, and also other nuances in the iconography and paleography, which I continue to work on. So I just want to acknowledge these individuals who have helped an enormous amount with this research that I've just presented to you. But also just to let you know, I'm currently in the process of publishing or republishing Hemi-Ra's false door. I'm giving another talk on modification, so an advancement on what I've done today at the Congress in Cairo in November. And as of today, actually, we've just launched an online forum around the subjects of modifications and reuse in ancient Egypt on the Fitzwilliam Museum website. So we'll send this out, or I'll email it to you, but also on the EF mailing list. And I hope you can be part of the discussion as well. So thank you for your time.